Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Gabriel Allen Cummings.
And I'm Brad Davidson, and this is Breaking the Code,
A podcast series by the Havas Medical Anthropology team. We're here to take the BS out of behavioral science by illuminating the why behind the what of behaviors, rituals, and symbols that people take for granted. We hope to arm you, our listeners, with the tools you need to make sense of behavioral science and help you apply it to your work as communication extraordinaires.
So this will be a good one. This is top of mind to everybody these days. We're going to be talking about obesity and GLP-1s, which are the Wegovy and Ozempics of the world. So interesting topic, huh?
Yeah, totally interesting topic. And I think that we should address it the way we kind of do it on Breaking the Code. And that's starting with the history of obesity, and not just the history of it, but like, where does the word come from? Brad, a lot of the feedback we get actually is like, I really like how Brad breaks down the word at the beginning. So take us through obesity and
Word of the
where
day,
does the word come from?
So first of all, let's take a step back. So there is a brand new set of products that are actually not brand new. They've been around for about a decade that are approved for weight loss. And if you didn't know that, it's because you live under a rock. Anybody who listens to this podcast is aware of it, I'm sure. But conceptually, we wanted to talk about obesity, specifically obesity, not overweightness, not any, but the idea of obesity as a disease. And what does that do conceptually? How does that change things around? First off, obesity is not a metaphor. It literally means eat everything. It's not eat everything, but if you translate it directly into English, it sounds a little naughty. It's an old Latin term. It just means like you've eaten so much. And that's the ECD part. That's the eat part, that you have eaten everything and you are, as a result, heavy. You know, your weight is up. I'm deliberately using words like heavy, not overweight, because that is another sort of interesting word, like overweight. That means there's a limit to weight, right? If your bag when you're flying is 51 pounds and the limit is 50, then you are overweight. So it implies that there's a limit to what a good weight is, or to weight, and you are over that limit, right? So you're overweight, you're obese. There's any number of terms for people who carry more body fat or who are just heavier than people think they should be. And this drug, this class of drugs, the glucagon-like peptide 1 agonists, I think they're agonists or inhibitors, I can't remember. Actually helped launch one years ago. They sort of address that. You lose weight, you feel full and you lose weight. And so they've been approved for that. But it is interesting. There's a concept going out there that there's too much weight on a body or too little weight on a body. It is hard to eat yourself to death immediately, but it is not hard to make yourself sick by being too heavy, you know, my 600-pound life kind of thing. So that's the origin of the word. We've known forever that there are people who are bigger than others, who carry more weight on their frame than other people do, and that much of it's not muscle, right? I think that's the other part of it is we're not talking about Hercules or any sort of like hugely muscled person, although that does confound definitions of obesity. We're talking about people who have a lot of adipose tissue, fat, right? So the history of this is it used to be a good thing, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm even thinking back, and this is like high school art history, and you'd have these, you know, these lush paintings of men and women. And if you wanted to show that they were like rich, or, you know, the aristocracy, if they were king, if they had power, they would show it with, you know, being overweight. It would be, you know, the symbol that I have resources, I have food. And so it's interesting to see, Brad, how, first of all, the difference in what they're consuming and the quality of food that they're consuming. Because back then, when I say back then, I'm talking like, you know, thousands, hundreds of years ago, they'd be eating the most rich foods, the lobster, the fish, the, you know, what, plenty of it. They'd have the banquet. And now when we look at obesity now, it's like, especially in the United States, it's your fast food, it's your people who don't have a lot of resources.
Right. So let's talk about like Fat Cal, right? That was the nickname for Taft. He was our fattest president ever, I think. But he was not seen as poor. He was seen as an overindulgent rich man. He was somebody who overate because he could. Henry VIII, famously a glutton, both in marriage and at the table. So, this idea of overconsumption being manifested in the body because people owned vast tracts of land in those days, owned, right? Again, like big air quotes, like everything was different back then. Like what you owned was also owned by the king and whatever. So, but this idea that like your body was a reflection of your social status. And if you think about today, the richest people on earth are walking around showing off how fit they are. So I remember we saw that thing about Zuckerberg bragging about his Murph, which for those of you who don't know, CrossFit is a fitness. I don't want to say anything too controversial, so I'll say approach. It does have lots of workouts that are named after military veterans, and one's called the Murph. It's named after this guy Murphy, and it's a tough thing to do. You got to do, I can't remember. You're supposed to wear a flak vest, which is 20 pounds, and then it's like 100 pull-ups, 200 push-ups, 300 squats. You run a mile, and then you run a mile. Zuckerberg posted a brag that he did it in under 40 minutes. And he was like, every year to demonstrate how much we care about veterans, we do this thing. I'm like, it seems more like you're posting how fit you are. But it's
Right.
not just Zuck. It's like Jeff Bezos now looks ripped, and the new rich is fit as hell. But that was not the new rich. The old rich back in the robber baron days was the idea of a corpulent guy carrying a diamond studded cane, that he was so heavy that he needed a cane to help walk. That was not a bad thing. And so, especially among men in the late 18th and 20th centuries, fatness was indexical of wealth, not poverty. You see pictures from the Dust Bowl of gaunt, skinny people with big working hands. Well, now you see Zuck and Jeff are trying to look skinny with big working hands because that's the new wealth, is longevity. And longevity comes not from being heavy, but from being skinny and fit. That's also new. The heavier you were throughout history, the more likely you were to be able to fight off infections and things like that. You had a bit of padding, literally and figuratively. So we've really turned around this idea of obesity as a symbol of having some kind of food security to obesity as a mark of poverty because you live in a food desert with processed foods. And so this is where the idea of classism, as well as the medical establishment colluding in a certain form of classism, people are starting to question the logic of making obesity a disease. Doesn't mean it's not a disease, doesn't mean doesn't drive disease, but is being heavy in and of itself a disease? And do we need to call it a disease in order for people to feel good about taking drugs about it? Because we didn't need to name it a disease for people to diet or exercise, but we need to name it a disease for insurers to be willing to pay for it. And that's sort of where things start to get a little tricky. So I know I've gone around and around it a little bit, but basically in history, through food insecurity and caloric insecurity, being fat meant you were both wealthy and of leisure. Now, being fat means you don't have the time to take care of your health and you're, quote, not smart enough, end quote, to do the necessary things to ensure your own longevity within the context of the first world. Because I still think if you're talking about something like Sudan, where there is famine everywhere, being fat still is a mark of being rich, because ain't nobody fat in the Sudan right now who's living at the knife edge of an internal civil war. So some of it's context, some of it's, first world versus the underdeveloped world, but a lot of it has to do with our manufacturing of cheap calories and our increasing sedentarism as we move off of the farm and into urban and suburban environments.
And one of the things I'm thinking about is like this concept of obesity as a disease. And Brad, you shared an article that we can leave in the show notes, really talking about the controversy around obesity being a disease. And I made me think about whether it's a disease of the body, like some people say, or if it's disease of the mind. And the role that GLP-1s have as being quote unquote obesity treatment, and how much that legitimizes obesity as a disease. So, I mean, there are a few ways I want to actually take this here. I think first it'd be important to talk about what does it mean to be a disease? And then we could talk about the GLP-1s and legitimizing obesity as a disease if we feel it's one.
Yeah, so there's a push and a pull here. If you call something a disease, you have validated it, right? It means there is a formal pathophysiological process, a damaging, negative, wayward process going on in your body that we can address through medical or lifestyle modifications. So, lactose intolerant, don't drink lactose, don't eat lactose. But if it's something more like rheumatoid arthritis, which is a disease of inflammatory signaling, as we understand it now, dysregulated inflammatory signaling, then we have drugs that will go in and try to help re-regulate or remodulate your inflammatory signaling at a cellular level, and that is drug that treats a disease, rheumatoid arthritis. Is obesity a mark of sloth? Is it a mark of a lack of moral character? Is it a lack of a lazy lifestyle? Is it a lack of access to proper nutrition and nutritional education? None of those things are diseases, right? It's a little bit like addiction. When you say addiction is a moral failing as opposed to a disease, you're saying the fault lies in the person not trying hard enough. When you make it, or the fault lies in us for not educating that person to understand what's going on, right? So is health literacy to blame? Is, people drinking soda, not water, because they just don't know any different? It's possible. Once you turn it into a disease, you're taking it out of the moral realm and into the physical realm and saying it's not your fault, right? So you didn't do anything to make this rheumatoid arthritis happen. Now, this is where it gets kind of tricky because things like smoking leads to lung cancer and emphysema. Unprotected sex leads to HIV infections and to Hep C infections, although Hep C is more shared needles. But these are behaviors that lead to diseases, and we have a tough time with them. We talked about that, like risk mitigation. We had a whole podcast on, does risk mitigation, like needle exchanges, encourage the behavior that leads to the diseases in the first place? That is a moral question. That is a behavioral science question. We came out very strongly. It does not. We don't care. We don't think that we need to have a moral evaluation. If there's a way of reducing harm, then we should do it. This gets to, are we giving people out for having behaved in a way that put them in a position to be heavy? Or are we validating that this was beyond their control in some ways, or no matter how they got there, is beyond their control now? That's a lot of where we get trained in things like HIV. Like, it's none of our business how somebody got HIV. There's no like better and worse ways or ways that we'll be more willing to treat you than others because you as an innocent child, Ryan White, didn't deserve, air quotes, HIV, whereas you, I don't know, Keith Haring, famous artist, but engaged in behaviors we don't like, so you deserved it more, right? Those were actual conversations early on in the HIV crisis. We're finding ourselves very clearly in that same space, and we are arguing about, are we, quote, letting people off the hook by calling it a disease when really it's just bad behavior and we're coddling them? Or are we recognizing that genes, environment, all the other things that kick off diseases are all at play, and that really it's not a moral failing, that yes, there's a behavioral component, but there's a behavioral component to everything we do. So I would say making it a disease takes it out of the moral realm, puts it in the physical realm. There are a number of examples in history, recent history, where we've managed to do that, to destigmatize diseases. So I would say depression is one. I would say HIV is another, but it's different. But there are a number of categories where fibromyalgia is the famous one, where women suffering from a disease called fibromyalgia, it was sort of non-specific pain syndrome. And people were like, it's men in charge of the medical establishment were basically saying, like, it's just crazy women. It mostly affected women, right? When the FDA approved Lyrica for the treatment of neuropathic pain and fibromyalgia, it validated fibromyalgia as a condition because an official government organization said it's a real disease. And that was the catalyst for everybody starting to take fibro seriously. It's interesting that the FDA approving a drug for a disease validated the disease in the first place, because you'd wonder how did they manage to register a trial, but that's how these things go. Scientology, this is a weird metaphor, but it's virtually identical, right? Scientology was finally validated as a religion, not by some religious organization, not by some council of priests or something like that, but it was by the IRS, who they judged that because Scientology was a religion, they didn't know taxes. And people were like, see, we're a church. We're an actual religion because the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, has granted us nonprofit or non-tax status. That's exactly how these things work, right? So the FDA approves something for obesity and suddenly it's a catalyst and obesity is a disease. Now, obesity was already seen as a disease, but we didn't have any treatments for it specifically. We had what we call TLC, therapeutic lifestyle changes. So we had diet, exercise, all those sorts of things, but we didn't really have a drug per se. There are weight loss aids, stimulants, for example, suppress your appetite, but we hadn't really coalesced around the idea that obesity is a disease, that is a pathophysiological process that we can modify positively through the application of pharmaceutical products. How's that?
That's fine. It sounds good. One of the things it's making me think about as we have these GLP-1s coming into the market is it's kind of explains why there's still controversy around it, why people are planting their flag sometimes and seeing obesity as a moral issue, and it can't be more than that. And that's why you hear things about like people will say GLP-1s are cheating, like you need to work out and do lifestyle changes and do possibly what I did or was doing in order to maintain my body as it is. And I'm fascinated by that conversation around GLP-1s and the legitimacy of obesity as a disease, because Brad, one of the things I'm taking away from what you're saying is like diseases need treatment or attempts to treat. It doesn't have to be like the treatment has to be there, but it needs to be something that needs to be understood and quelled and done away with in a pharmaceutical sense, not just a discipline and moral or you are evil inside of you sense.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the other things about GLP-1s though is like more of the reality of it, who's using it, and do people see it as treating obesity, or is this just like body modification is just like
Yeah,
you
right.
inject the steroids so you can get bigger muscles. I'm being very flippant, but you inject steroids to get bigger muscles. You inject GLP-1s and, you lose the stubborn 10 pounds. And it's not to say that you're not feeling better, like your health hasn't improved because you lost the 10 pounds, but is it treating obesity?
Yeah, listen, I think obesity is harder to define than people think it is.
Right.
We use body mass index, for example, but I'm not saying anything people don't know. Most players in the NFL are considered morbidly obese. Body mass index does not account for things like being massively strong with huge muscles. So, there's all sorts of other ratios they'll do. If you're a certain sort of body morphology, very, very, very muscly, they'll tape you, right? Which means they'll do the ratio of your circumference of your waist to the circumference of your neck. In the military, that's what they do. I have a friend who was in the Marine Corps who's super muscly, and he always was failing the fitness requirement until they would tape him, and then the ratio was fine, and he would move on because they would look at him and they go, "You're clearly fit. You just don't. You're too heavy for your height." So we don't have good measures is one thing. I also think, it's a perceptual thing of like, is this a natural consequence of your own behavior? In which case, in a Protestant work ethic sort of way, like you reap what you sow. So if you don't save enough money, and you go bankrupt, what is our moral obligation to help you? Well, if you eat too much food and you get, so big that it's driving disease processes like hypertension and heart failure, what do we owe you? You did this to yourself. But,
I mean, yeah,
yeah,
sorry to cut you off for a second, but
no,
we were talking about cancer a few episodes ago and
correct,
smoking cancers, and it's
correct.
difficult to have that empathy when it's like you smoked and you went out and you did this despite the fact that you knew it gave you cancer. It's difficult for me as an outside person to not look at you and say you did this to yourself. And then from a treatment perspective, I can't speak for doctors entirely, but I also imagine that it's difficult to have that empathy when it comes to, Brad, I know you often refer to the oath of Maimonides, treating my fellow human in pain when I perceive that this pain that you've done to yourself is self-inflicted.
It's frustrating. I will say I do understand where clinicians are coming from. So years ago, we did a very long ethnography of diabetes conversations, and they are what we call in linguistics very agonistic at some points. And what you'll have is doctors sort of yelling at patients, but it's out of frustration. And I'm going to paraphrase, but it'll go something like this. We had one guy on tape basically saying this: look, Joe, you're going to lose your feet. You keep telling me that you don't know what to do, and I keep telling you we've told you what to do. It's take the drugs we give you. It's eat less. It's eat differently. And every time you come in here, you're worse. You haven't done what we asked you to do. You still smoke. And then you ask me what to do. Now, again, like, okay, so now I'm no longer like paraphrasing, right? But that is an understandable but not helpful conversation. And the fact that these doctors are getting frustrated over the lack of follow through on the part of the patients is mirrored by the patient's frustration that things aren't getting better. And it's just not a very good conversation to watch. That is true. And for things like massively obese people, my 600-pound life, there is a psychological pathology to eating so much that you become 900 pounds in a shut-in. And very often, that's the part that you need to untangle first. When we're talking about obesity and GLP-1s, we're really talking more about people whose body morphology is not staggering, but is big. I'm really struggling for words here because all the words themselves are kind of loaded. Again, like this overweight, like what's your baseline weight? Well, it's BMI. Well, BMI doesn't work. So, there was discussions around Lizzo, if you remember, like what's healthy fat? And it's healthy fat, big air quotes, is when you are compared to what people expect you should be, but you don't have hypertension or diabetes or any of the other sort of challenges that people associate with overweightness. And then there was a big argument. There's no such thing as healthy fat. There is such a thing as healthy fat. This is not an argument that they would have had with Henry VIII because life expectancy was short and being fat gave you some resilience or carrying extra weight around the middle. Let's put it that way, right? And so, it's again, like it's this notion of, is it a moral failing to behave in a way that eventually makes you sick? Well, we don't really see like CEOs who are working themselves to the bone as morally failing, even though they're making themselves sick. So I think we have to be honest that as a society, a lot of it has to do with who is overweight, why they're overweight, and to what end their own behavior has been engaged in. Because we somehow applaud the CEO who works himself or herself into a state of exhaustion, which we know leads to millions of health complications. Maybe not millions, but lots, right? But we applaud them because they're doing it in service of something we believe is morally correct. Whereas somebody who goes, I'm just going to eat another cheesesteak, and we view that as morally incorrect because for some reason that's not in service of something that we think is worthwhile. So we have to admit that part of the reason that we used to think being heavy was good and now we think it's bad is because the poor were skinny and now the poor are heavy. We have to think of our sense of what diseases are worth treating as related to who is suffering that disease. I'm saying the same thing twice, but this is a little different. So for example, interest in sickle cell was not that big when I was a kid, in part because we didn't have anything for it, but in part because frankly it affected people of color and we as a society weren't investing in healthcare for descendants of African slaves, frankly.
Right.
And so, it's impossible to separate the social context of obesity and the moral evaluations of the behavior of the poor from this idea that it's a disease. And that gets back to your point of who's getting it. Is it people who want to look better in a dress or a suit at an awards ceremony versus people who are at risk of immediate physical harm because their knees are going and they're not going to be able to walk to work anymore? We have a number of issues there that we could unpack, but this is not about the allocation of health resources. Podcast is really about what happens when we call something a disease. What happens when we call something a disease is we validate it, we take it out of the moral realm, we make it possible for people to treat it without shame, but we almost always start at the top and work our way down. So that is, true for a lot of different disease states that we can think of. But in this case, we don't need to go into anything more than just mention that there's tons of articles about who is getting to the front of the line for GLP-1s. Is it the people who need it the most? Is it the people who will benefit the most? Don't know. It's the people who've got the best insurance and who have ready access to a doctor and who can pay a copay. That's who's getting it right now. So I don't know. Do you think it's going to work on obesity stigma? Do you think it'll change?
It's difficult to say because I've been really tangling with this idea of how do you address stigma in the first place? And you mentioned Lizzo, and so my mind went to body positivity and
Right.
the question of whether or not it ever really existed, because now we have the prevalence of, GLP-1s, this quote unquote miracle drug. And now it's like, it was never okay to be overweight. It was never okay to be obese. It was never okay to, I think what I'm trying to say here is that when it comes to this kind of stigma, how did GLP-1s place there? And the way I see it is like you have body positivity, right? And that's like when you look at yourself in the mirror, this is like your loneliest moments. And this is like in the moment, So seconds from now, you could get up and look at yourself in the mirror and, you have to be okay with what you see in the mirror. Otherwise, your life is going to be dangerously affected. I'm talking mental health now.
Right.
And then there's the GLP-1 aspect, which for as quick and rapid turnaround as it seems, it's a process, right? Where you will get on this drug, hopefully, eventually, if you need it, and lose the weight. But that's something that's gradual. This idea of body positivity, and it's kind of something that I'm unlocking now. So I'm kind of speaking in a slow, roundabout way. But it's like body positivity is like what exists in the moment. I see it as, how you view yourself as yourself right now. And GLP-1s are like another solve. And so when it comes to this idea of stigma and how stigma can be removed, I feel like there's two ways to do it. There's the love yourself, body positivity approach, where you're able to address the stigma head on, that I am not a morally failed person. I am not an awful person because I look like this. And then there's the GLP-1 route, which kind of takes the weight, the root of the stigma, where the thing is coming from, out of the equation. I don't know if the body positivity thing would ever completely alleviate the stigma, maybe the shame for an individual, but I think the removal of the thing entirely, this in this case being the weight, then the stigma, the shame is gone.
I think there's tension because I think historically the body you have is a result of the work you do and the position you occupy in the world. So I remember I'm now thinking of like a woman who was much older than me, who's since passed, right? But sort of a mentor of mine, and she was saying when she was growing up in working class America, she was very working class. She said men were hard and smelly because what she meant was they all did physical labor in her world, right? So they all had like strong hands, they smelled bad, and they were muscly because they were all mechanics and shop floor workers and, construction guys, and they worked with their hands, not their heads, And mommies were soft and smelled like the kitchen. Now that is the most gendered thing I've ever heard, right? But that whole like they're soft and they, because once you have kids, your body changes. I've been around that. I obviously do not have a female body, but I've been around a female producing children. It does affect your body, both short and long term, and so your body was a result of your position and also your occupation. Now, so many of us work behind a keyboard. Our body is really a reflection of the choices we make in our leisure time. And that is a widening gulf between hand workers and head workers. But also, B, it means that we read the body differently. It's not simply a result of what you do, which very often was something you were born into. Now it is choice. And so now we look at people who are carrying around extra weight, let's take Lizzo, and go, even if you're healthy, even if you're positive yourself, you could do better. You have the time, you have the resources, you have the knowledge, and you've still allowed, big air quotes, yourself to inhabit a body we don't approve of. That's really difficult to remove entirely. I don't think we have removed it entirely. I think we still think of certain things as cheating. Bodybuilding. Are you natural or not? Natty or not? Right? Like, do you take
Right.
steroids or not? Are you taking GLP-1s or not? Are you, is Jeff Bezos taking human growth hormone? That's one of the rumors around Bezos, is that he went from this sort of like rather sun-chested nerd, frankly, didn't look very intimidating at all, to a pretty pretty fit looking guy in aviator sunglasses who's kind of looking a little badass, like that's the new billionaire look. Is it natural? Is it not? Does it matter? I don't think there's anything natural about any of our weight. I think it's got to do with genes in some ways. It's got to do with choices in others. And a lot of it's got to do with environment and the positions we're put in. When I was commuting every single day into Manhattan, 4.5 hours total, I was in much worse shape. That's a lot of time to be just sort of standing around on train platforms and sitting on your butt on a train. And so, I think some of this is lifestyle, some of it's imposed. But will we destigmatize weight? It really depends. It's very hard to avoid the discussion that Lizzo is African American. It's very hard to avoid the discussion that poverty, race, lifestyle are all tied together. And so that discussion to me was an interesting one, but it was also a very fraught discussion. And a lot of the people who were pushing back against Lizzo being a quote role model for normalizing quote unhealthy weight really weren't at all concerned about Lizzo. I don't think. I never heard people going like, I'm just so worried about her. They were more worried about like, well, she has a responsibility to be, moral and all this stuff. I'm like, well, Jeff Bezos has a moral responsibility to show generosity. Like I'm not so sure why the body is so important, but think about whose bodies we care about more than others. There's a lot of
Hmm.
discussion around like control of female bodies. There's a lot of discussion of control of bodies, big social component to that as well. And that, look, I will give you the last word if you'd like on that sort of concept, but I don't think we can just talk about weight without talking about how we view behavior in general, how we view the responsibility of people whose behaviors make them say, quote, sick. What do we mean by that? Everything we do has consequences somewhere down the road. So it's all about risk and benefit. It's not healthy, for example, to expose your abdomen. There's a reason we put fat around our belly. You're not supposed to have a thin wall of muscle between your guts and the world. It's supposed to protect you a little bit. But since we're not getting attacked by leopards very often anymore, it doesn't really matter. Leopards probably don't attack your belly, but you know what I mean. Like
Yeah.
our vision of what's healthy has part to do with where we see danger. We don't see danger of starving immediately, imminently in this country very often. We see longevity as the goal because we've solved the immediate problems. I think obesity in Darfur would be still seen as a mark of safety against the famine that is ripping through there. So, it's a lot to process. I am in favor of GLP-1s. I think they're wonderful. I think we will assimilate them. I think we don't have the ability to control ourselves as well as we should. I think that has to do with biology. I think that has to do with evolution. There's no benefit to self-control in the short term. It's only a long-term problem. So, I think one of the things I like about Mackenzie Bezos, Jeff Bezos' ex-wife, and I'll be very pointed here, is she clearly understands the concept of having enough. I think that's where the GLP-1s can really help us. Like, what is enough? What is enough from a calorie intake standpoint? What is enough from a too skinny, too heavy? When does the medical establishment intervene for pathology versus, hey man, you want to be quote fat and happy, end quote, go for it. That's really where I come in. Like we have not worked out a moral framework for how to apply these things, not so much as like who deserves it, but what does it mean when we give it to them?
And just to add on, you said that you don't think we have the ability to control ourselves as well as we should. I mean, I even think as well as we think we have control over ourselves, I don't think we have control over ourselves as well as we think. One thing that I've been thinking about as we talk about disease, and I we're 40 something episodes in, so I'd like to think that Breaking the Code can have classic episodes. One of the classic episodes of Breaking the Code was this conversation of disease and illness, right? And so I think about obesity as an illness, it is the living condition of living with this quote unquote disease. It's something that I think about, and as we begin to engage more with GLP-1s, I have a feeling that it's going to be something that may become generalized just because, again, obesity, GLP-1s, it's all so controversial. One thing that I was thinking about, and I'm a heavier guy, I'll say it, but it's like it doesn't affect everybody the same way. I was thinking I've been heavy my entire life. How has it affected me? I still play sports. I still keep up. I'm strong, all these things. And of course, there's, like down the line and hard conditions and everything like that. But again, as a lived experience is what I'm going for here. And I think about things like my mind is kind of hooked on the idea of calling someone fat was just so fascinating to me as I thought about it more. So, Brad, I'm going to use you as an example for this, and I'm going to put my linguist cap on. I feel like you'd probably do a better job at this, but it's just something I've been thinking about. So, if Brad, if you're covered in dirt, I may call you dirty, right? You like
Yes,
of dirt, right? You'll have the Y at the end. You're dirty, right? And if you have a smell that's not particularly great, I may call you smelly or stinky of the smell, right? Of the stink. It's something on top of Brad that we can
correct.
then be removed, that can be modified. But calling someone fat, and when it comes to not being bullied, I'm very fortunate. I had a good set of friends, good set of classmates. Nobody was really picky in that way, but I've been called fat enough times to really think about it. When you say this person is fat, it is the weight that is on their body. It is them, right? You
Yes.
are fat. It becomes them, their identity. It's not something that could be so easily removed in that way. And so when we think about obesity as an illness and we think about the people who are afflicted by it, it can come in a lot of different ways. There's bullying, of course, and things involved, but it's also the small things too. How I see myself in the mirror, Brad, when you go in the mirror, it's I could take a shower and the dirt's gone. I could again take a shower, put on cologne, use soap or something, and the smell's gone. The things that end in Y, dirty, smelly, can be taken away. Fat takes a little bit longer, is a little bit more stubborn, cannot be removed that easily, and is more closely tied to someone's identity.
Absolutely. Well, listen, I think you've got a real insight there, right? Because you think of things like smart, fast, fat, they are inherent, okay? Whereas when you call somebody a smarty, like you're being a smarty pants, that's sort of a temporary thing. Now, I'm just sort of shooting from the hip here, but it is interesting. We don't view fat as sort of like transient. It's
Mm-hmm.
much more of a state than a passing thing. Now, we've talked about this before too. Like, I'm not unaware that I'm built the way I am, largely because of genes and partly because of how I carry myself, right? I do exercise and I don't overeat and stuff. But trust me, I have indulged plenty of overeating in my life. If I hadn't come from more of my mom's side than my dad's side, I wouldn't be built the way I am. And yet it is hard not to look at that and feel a sense of moral superiority. And so that's got to do with socialization and like, I'm so great, I'm skinny, right? Whereas as we've discussed, it's not like you eat particularly more than I do. You carry considerably more weight than I do on a similar frame. You're not, when I say considerably, by the way, I just mean we're not talking like minor differences. I go up and down 10 pounds or so. I don't think you and I have the same build. I don't think it stops you from doing what you want to do. And that's where this whole like healthy fat idea came in, or healthy weight, or whatever. There's no ideal body. It's, can you do what you want to? Can you go for the walk or the hike or the whatever you want to? That is true. It's also not true, because 50 extra pounds on your knees over time does hurt your knees. And
Right.
so we're really stuck between this, like, I want to encourage you to be as healthy as humanly possible. That includes feeling good about yourself. And therein lies the rub. And this is where I think maybe the biggest benefit of calling something a disease that I've seen in my lifetime is that it takes it out of that moral realm and allows it to be treated in a very matter of fact way. Once you medicalize something, it's in the realm of doctors, and now you've given up your right, as it were. I'm really struggling for the right words here, to have your own opinion about it. Like, well, I think diabetes is wonderful. Like, no one's going to care what you think, right? This is where obesity as a lifestyle disease, this is where depression as a lack of moral fiber, this is where HIV as a mark of a lack of personal responsibility. We run into these moral arguments, addiction as something that you did to yourself, and we go back and forth. You mentioned smoking. I had a doctor tell me nobody chooses to become addicted to the most addictive substance known to man, and we used to advertise to children, and everybody I know who smoked started well before they were of the age of consent. I certainly did. I started at about 15. That was actually old for my friends. And so, he was like, I hold blameless even the smokers because they didn't intend to become addicted. He was sort of an N of one, though. So it's a thorny set of issues. Unfortunately, I don't know if we've really answered any of them, but I do think the biggest issue here is it a moral disease? Or is it moral and a moral failing? Is it biology and a disease? Is it both? Whose bodies are we concerned with? Whose morality are we concerned with? And who's busy saying that people shouldn't be this way anyway? Because again, it seems to be that however you are, if you're rich, it's good, and if you're poor, it's not. And that's throughout history. I mean, that's not changed at all. And we need to be careful how we're talking about, the intention of all of this stuff. Because if it's just to make people who are wealthy slightly more fit, then it's, if it's to help people who are stuck in an endless cycle of obesity, and I'm using that very advisedly, and are, stuck in a food desert or just stuck in a biological feedback loop where it's very difficult for their body to give up the extra calories. They hold on no matter what dieting they do. Then yeah, I think GLP-1s are revolutionary, and they're going to make people's lives much, much better, especially as we look towards longevity as the goal, not just immediate health.
Brad, I have a feeling this won't be our only episode on GLP-1s or obesity. I feel like we're going to be talking about this for episodes to come. I feel like
it's so
there's a
deep.
lot to discuss.
Yeah, 100%.
But I think we'll call it here for the conversation. Thank you, everyone, for listening, for Breaking the Code. I'm Gabriel Allen Cummings.
And I'm Brad Davidson. And this has been a pleasure. And Gabe, yeah, there's just so much to unpack here.
Yeah, so much. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Until next time.
Breaking the Code is a podcast created by the Havas Medical Anthropology Group. Hosted by Brad Davidson and Sanika Garcia. Content and post-production audio editing done by Gabriel Allen Cummings. And inspiration from all of you. Thank you for listening and for your continued support. If you enjoy these episodes, we'd love to hear from you. Please leave a rating, subscribe, and send us a message to our mailbox at medicalanthropology@havas.com. Until next time.